Welcome to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. This week, we look at the world through the lens of a Lebanese satirist and an Iranian-American filmmaker. In the second half of our show, we'll speak with noted writer, director, and producer Cyrus Nowrasteh about navigating the treacherous shoals of Hollywood political correctness. Up first, we're pleased to welcome Karl Sharro, architect by day, but political and cultural satirist by night, commenting on the complexities of the Middle East from a distinctly Lebanese perspective. Karl, welcome to the show. Kifak, ça va?
Yeah, hi, Bill. I see you can speak perfect Lebanese.
There you go.
Which, as you know, it has to be 3 different languages in one sentence. Well, thanks so much for having me on. I'm really excited to be on with you and to talk about all the topics about the Middle East and Lebanon.
It should be fun, Karl. You wrote a blog piece titled, "Study Confirms that Lebanon is indeed the center of the universe." And in it, you wrote that the Lebanese have perfected the art of marketing over centuries, but since they don't actually produce anything, the only thing they could market was themselves. Having been blessed with marrying a Lebanese woman 5 years ago and being welcomed into our expat community, I can attest to the fact that I know of no other country that exports so many talented people. I asked you on today to give us some insight into what's going on in the Middle East from the Lebanese perspective, which is a country that seems to be the only island of relative sanity surrounded by despots and strife. Start off by sharing a little background about yourself.
Well, I'm not actually just Lebanese. I'm half Lebanese, half Iraqi, but I grew up mostly in Lebanon. But I used to kind of travel around the region. And I think this is quite important to my experience because a lot of my friends growing up, and I grew up from the war generation, grew up during the Civil War in Lebanon, being exposed, traveling around Syria, Iraq, Turkey, and all those countries gives you quite a different perspective. And then I've sort of moved on, lived for around 30 years in Lebanon, moved then to where I live in London now, studied architecture, which is really what I do as a full-time job. But my hobby is then writing predominantly satire about the Middle East. And I think some people might think this is an unusual choice for comedy, Middle Eastern politics, but I think it's quite a challenge and it kind of appeals to me. And this is where I ended in this sort of position where in my part-time or lunch breaks, I find myself writing satire about Middle Eastern politics and society.
That's where I discovered you actually on Twitter. I understand you're a fan of Woody Allen's stand-up routines.
Oh, yeah, this goes way back. And I think some people find it kind of strange, particularly, I think, because it's not so fashionable anymore, and most people who know Woody Allen would know him more for his films rather than for his stand-up. But I think when I first heard it, and that must have been late 80s, I think it was mind-blowing because you never see or never saw in those days a stand-up comedian kind of mixing, the highbrow with the lowbrow, sports with philosophy and all those combinations. But also he had this great persona. He's sort of the outsider. And before that, stand-up comedians used to be the kind of very macho, dominant personality. And he's this little guy, kind of all these flows. And I thought, that's a great persona. I love that persona. That suits me. I don't have to be the tough guy. And I can be wisecracking about all those issues and about politics using that sort of, as I say, it's complex. It's a bit highbrow, a bit lowbrow. So I think it was great. And I think it remained an influence on my writing ever since.
Well, complexity is the byword in the Middle East. I'd like to start with a fairly complicated question. Lebanon seems pretty unique in that it's neither in the midst of a civil war, at least right now, nor is it ruled with an iron fist by a dominant tribe, as many Middle Eastern countries are. It's usually described as a multi-confessional state, which some have proposed as a model for other Middle East societies. Describe for us both how a multi-confessional state works and how they break down.
Well, Lebanon is unique in that sense because, as you mentioned, there aren't that many other states that follow this model. And essentially what it is a kind of highly informal arrangements. Most of them are not written for power sharing between the different denominations in Lebanon. And there are basically 19 of them that are officially recognized, Muslims, Christians, and tiny Jewish minority as well, that are all recognized by Lebanese law. So these kind of informal agreements regulate how they interact between each other and between the kind of this denominations and the state and how individuals interact with the state. And this used to be criticized a lot. And in my youth, I was one of those radical secularists who were completely opposed to that system because we thought it was too oppressive. The best person for the job often didn't get the job because it was based more on your affiliation. But kind of as I grow older, I'm not necessarily a fan of the system. I see how it has worked to preempt or prevent what happened in other countries in the Middle East, where this sort of the narrative of secularization was used to stifle dissent in the country. So you look at countries like Syria and Iraq, and I think it sort of provided a mechanism for pluralism to express itself with all its flaws that ended protecting the country firstly from a strong dictatorship like what happened in other countries, because you had this power always kind of distributed among different groups. And whenever one group got more powerful, then the others agitated, and not always in a peaceful manner, sometimes violently, but then until things settled down. So firstly, it prevented a kind of dictatorship from rising in Lebanon. And secondly, what I think following the end of the Civil War in 1990, I think the model has also worked to prevent further escalations of civil strife or new civil wars, if you want to put it like that. It's not perfect. It has huge problems. But I think within the realms of the possible at the moment, it creates those islands of freedom of expression, of pluralism, that as much as my the radical secularist inside me wants to get rid of the system, I think its advocates are right in the sense that Lebanon is still kind of providing a sense of normalcy, albeit a completely dysfunctional one.
Right. It's a state that's hanging in there. It's remarkably robust. And yet when it comes to everyday life, a lot of stuff doesn't work. I understand the country just came through an unusual garbage crisis.
Well, yeah, this is a manifestation among probably hundreds of various, issues that other states know how to deal with efficiency. We're talking about collecting garbage, which should be, the most kind of menial task, the mundane task that a government or a municipality carries out. But even that becomes contested and falls into all these problems. And that's the flip side to this system, this almost paralysis. There's no mechanism to resolve those confrontations anymore, alongside with, there's no regular supply of electricity in the country.
Right.
25 years after the end of the Civil War. So that is the flip side. It's almost as if the lack of concentration of power prevents authoritarianism, but on the other hand, it prevents anything from being done. But having said that, I think there's a great youthful energy in the country that's kind of rocking the boat, to testing the limits, challenging the status quo. And that's a testament to the great energies that a country like Lebanon produces that I'm, let's say, medium term, not in the short term. I'm very optimistic about their capability to kind of start pushing the state to fix these problems. And if not, they're going to be dislocated and someone new will come in.
You talk about energy and rebelliousness. What is it about Lebanese drivers that make them so especially terrifying?
Well, this is a very funny one for me personally, because I'll tell you what, whenever I go back to Lebanon and I start driving, on the first few hours, I say to myself, I'm going to be a model European driver. I'm going to obey all the rules, and I'm just going to teach all those people what's the right way to drive. But within a couple of hours, I'm a raging, mad, suicidal driver who's just zooming in between cars, because it's almost like a libertarian ideal of driving where no rules apply and every man, every woman for themselves. And then it gets to you. You quickly kind of settle into this mode where, like, I'm competing against everyone else. Now, again, it's one of those things. It's if you don't know the unwritten rules, you wouldn't be able to deal with it. But if you're a Lebanese driver, 9 times out of 10, you'd be able to negotiate your way. But then on the other hand, you see some of the atrocious accidents and you think, God, if you followed some basic rules, none of this would be happening. So it's, again, I think it's testament to this anarchic spirit within the country that's at both irritating and dangerous, but on the other hand, it's kind of what drives it, this sense of energy that kind of refuses to submit to the rules, which has its positive side.
It also tends to drive a lot of talented people out. I mean, I think about all the Lebanese communities around the world. There's probably more in number and more successful Lebanese expats everywhere than in any other country of that size. Hasn't this drained the society of their best talent?
Well, I think it depends how you see it, because there's quite a strong interconnectedness between the diaspora, even if they've been gone for, decades or sometimes centuries, and the country. So it's not a case of people cutting themselves off completely from the country. And in fact, a lot of the economy keeps you surviving because of remittances and the investment that Lebanese who live abroad bring back to the country. So there are flip sides to this. But I think you have to look, and as we talked in the beginning about the example about Lebanon, is the center of the universe and how Lebanese promote themselves. You're talking about a culture that has been exporting people not only for centuries, for millennia. It's about trade. It's about discovering new places. And I think that's not such a bad thing. The bad thing is the country isn't being able to provide for its citizens, for the people who choose to stay in. But the sense of Lebanese adventurism and kind of wanting to go out to the world and achieve things and discover new things, that's fantastic. I mean, the best example of it is you can have great Lebanese food anywhere in the world today.
Well, this goes back to the Phoenicians. So you're right, it's millennial.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and in my kind of previous work, I had this cartoon series about two Phoenician characters, and it was basically kind of satirizing this idea that the Lebanese invented everything. We're like the Greeks. So it was really satirizing that Lebanese obsession with the idea that the Phoenicians are our direct ancestors and they invented everything. But at the same time, I can't deny that part of that kind of entrepreneurial spirit, the adventurism, the willingness to go abroad and try new things, it's there in the country.
Karl, the so-called Arab Spring has triggered all sorts of unfortunate consequences as one stable dictatorship after another has been toppled and replaced mostly with chaos. You wrote a tongue-in-cheek piece titled, "The Arab Spring was just a translation mistake." Take a moment to describe that piece and then the deeper meaning behind it.
Well, I think this came on the back of when I started writing satire about particularly the so-called Arab Spring. A lot of it was directed towards people kind of projecting these narratives on what was actually happening from the outside. And the kind of the details, the nuance were lost in these kind of prepackaged narratives that didn't quite apply to the situation on the ground. And things weren't so black and white. And I was thinking of a device, and actually, how can you exploit that? How you can explain this idea that this was there was something wrong about it, but as well try to express when that piece was written, there was already a sense of defeatism setting in about, what has gone wrong. We had so much big aspirations.
Yep.
And then I came up with this kind of idea that this was only just a translation mistake. And, all the countries started saying, no, the foreign journalists didn't understand what was happening. The people were actually demonstrating because they wanted to thank their rulers, not because they wanted to get rid of them. And it was kind of literally just that, a comic device to kind of expose those narratives that were starting to emerge, and people saying we've had fatigue from the revolutions and we don't want to go down that road anymore. So it was just a way of kind of playing around with this at the same time while expressing this sense of defeatism and a sense of kind of exasperation with the process of change.
You need a good sense of irony to read your pieces, which is often so hard in writing to communicate the irony. You do it so well. You've written a series of confused person guides to things like the Iran deal, Yemen, the Middle East conflict. I mean, each of them is funny and sad in its own way, but I have to ask, are you a fatalist? Is the Middle East doomed to an endless cycle of despair because of its complexity?
Well, this is interesting for me because, in fact, I'm an optimist, and this might surprise you to hear. And what I do mostly is actually kind of spoofing this idea that the Middle East is a fatalistic place, and it's intentionally set up to mock that idea and to say these people are kind of, it's their destiny to fight constantly and all of that kind of thing. And it's actually, it's complete, what I believe personally is completely the opposite. I think, processes of change take a long time, but we can see the energy and the dynamism. Well, obviously, sometimes you can kind of, from a year to two, it's a very narrow period of time to judge it by, but it's kind of exploiting that sense of, people projecting, if they don't know the Middle East very well, projecting this sense of fatalism about the region, which I have to tell you is quite present in the region itself.
Sure.
So it's a way to challenge that and say, no, let me mock you by mockingly using this device. But reality is, with time, things will get better, and I'm very, very optimistic.
I'd like to quote from a Spoof press release you wrote titled "God Resigns Over Situation in the Middle East." Let me quote you. In a surprising announcement he made during a hastily convened press conference, God has declared that he is resigning over the situation in the Middle East and other global failures, which he takes full responsibility for. God made it clear that his position has become untenable, but he will stay on as caretaker deity until a replacement could be found. Karl, all the monotheistic religions and sects in the Middle East spring from a common root we call the Abrahamic tradition. Was all this a colossal mistake? Would we have been better off if Greco-Roman polytheism never got displaced?
No, on a serious note, I think the legacy of the Abrahamic religions is fantastic because, again, I consider myself a humanist, a secularist of the Enlightenment tradition, and all the intellectual roots for that come from the Abrahamic religions. They come from the Bible. They come from the exchange between the Muslims and Europe. So without dwelling too much on it, there's quite a strong heritage in there. And it's one specifically that talks about this idea that human beings are not subject to accidents and chance. There's a meaning to life. And even though it's kind of prescribed religiously in the religious text, and the Enlightenment came to it from a secular point of view, but it shows this idea for the first time in the history of humanity, the peoples that could be masters of their own destiny, they have a choice. And these are all kind of serious things. And the idea of kind of then lampooning, this God resigning, it was more a kind of a response to people saying, it became common in parts of the Middle East to say, we don't have anyone else but God. There was this moment of resignation. And I thought, well, there's so much sense of expectation that probably God is just going to quit. So he announced his resignation. And now you're on your own. Get your act together and sort it out.
So speaking of sorting things out, Karl, we're in the midst of one of the largest mass migrations in history as millions of people flee the spreading chaos in Arab and Muslim lands. You're a champion of the universal freedom of movement as expressed in the famous inscription at the foot of the Statue of Liberty. This worked for the U.S. across most of our history when we were a growing nation spreading out across a sparse continent. But how can that work in European societies and even in contemporary America where regulatory, fiscal, and monetary policies have virtually stamped out growth?
Well, that's a very important link, I think, in between the two, because I've written a lot about the subject of open borders and freedom of movement, and I've done a TED talk about it, or TEDx rather, and I've always linked it with this idea. If you want to have an open society, it has to be a dynamic society. It can't be this stale, kind of immovable, fixed, rigid society like what's emerging in parts of Western Europe and, sad to say, in America as well. It's this kind of the sense that we can't do big things anymore. We sort of have, it's almost like someone retiring and not wanting any more surprises in life or too many changes in life. So you have to think of like, it's almost like the West is just kind of living on its pension now.
But we are.
No, but why?
Because look at the demographics. We are living on our pensions. Look, nobody's having babies anymore. We've got these huge entitlement burdens. And because of that, we've stopped growth. How can we absorb immigrants?
But that's precisely it. Why did we stop growth? But my kind of response would be that this attitude to growth today is more of a cultural mindset. We're living a very pessimistic cultural moment. And this has to do with the legacy of the 70s and, the oil crisis and things like that. And particularly the end of the Cold War when the West sort of lost its raison d'etre and it never recovered it. And we're still in this moment of discovery. So what we're doing at the moment while we're kind of looking out for the next idea is allowing the pessimists to dictate the terms of our future. And we shouldn't be doing that. No sane society should let the pessimists decide its future.
So doesn't that mean the first problem we should address is regaining our ability to grow?
Precisely, and absolutely. And I have problems, Mike. I consider myself politically on the left, and I have big problems with the majority of the left today in that it's kind of going into this direction that is anti-growth and saying things like extremely stupid things like prosperity without growth. There is no prosperity without growth. But by growth, we don't mean, this perception that the bankers should get richer. That's not what growth means. It's about our ability as society to produce more material affluence, more goods, more infrastructure, more investment in education and health. All of these things require a dynamic society that invests big time, but also is capable of being dynamic and increasing its productivity, not only so it can sustain its own population, but to make the most out of the arrivals, the new arrivals that would give it this injection of dynamism. And I'm not talking here strictly in value terms, in economic terms, because I believe newcomers can enrich any new place as long as there's a proper avenue for them to integrate within society and to kind of express themselves freely. This is what we're talking about, is a vision. It's not a utopia. This is what drove countries like the U.S. You look at its most flourishing period. It's between the end of the Civil War and the beginning of World War I. You're talking about a period of massive population movement, but as well of massive growth, which produced fantastic results in the long term. And I think this spirit is what's needed now, not only in America, it's needed in Europe, because you have the problem of aging populations and kind of lack of any imagination, what I call the social imagination, to reimagine these societies, to kind of attempt to create a different way of doing things that is much more dynamic, that not about just kind of resigning and settling in for a long retirement.
As a short-term solution, while we wrestle with the issue of growth, what's wrong with only accepting the best and the brightest immigrants rather than the poor and huddled masses? I mean, that is bringing people who have enough financial and human capital with them to be a net gain to society.
Look, there's the principle and there's policy matters. I'm talking here about the principle. At the end of the day, every country should be free to set its immigration policy itself. And there's no point in us shaming countries and saying, no, you have to accept all these people. I mean, look at what happened to Greece. No sane person can argue today that Greece on its own can absorb millions of Syrian immigrants with the situation that it's in. What we're saying here is there's a matter of principle and there's a matter of policy. But if you want to look at the matters of policy, it's what sets, the situation, particularly in Europe now, is EU policy. And you have to admit that EU policy has been a complete failure in that. Because if you wanted to absorb all these people because of principles that you've been preaching for so long, then you could apply yourself, or the EU could apply itself more enthusiastically to the task and find different ways of distributing these refugees. And definitely then the question of who's kind of more needy or more needed rather, all these should be discussed in kind of national policy forums, and then every country has to have the sovereignty to decide on these things. Unfortunately, we're not having that debate at all at the moment. We're having a highly charged, emotive debate that's not focusing neither on this kind of principle, the broad principle and how you apply it, nor about respecting the kind of the nuances of national policy framework in each instance, which again, you have to be realistic about. We can't go around kind of overloading Greece when there are countries that are taking 500 or 1,000 refugees in. So this is the kind of the tricky bit about the whole debate now in Europe. But unfortunately, what was kind of promised to be this great idea that's bringing all of Europe together is now disintegrating at the site of the first challenge. And you look even historically at the record of Europe in absorbing refugees. I mean, Germany alone, right in the aftermath of World War II, absorbed 10 million ethnic Germans from Eastern Europe. So, and it had no resources at the time. So where there's a will, there's a way. But obviously, there has to be a debate about it. It has to be done in an open and clear manner. And I don't think any of those things are happening at the moment in Europe.
So, Karl, you're a prolific blogger and tweeter. I enjoy so much of your material. You seem to be using that and your humor to make the world a better place. Where do we go from here?
Well, I just have to start to saying I'm not really a social reformer, but I think if you are able to make people laugh these days, it's a great achievement. But particularly if you are able to make that humor translate across languages and cultures. And I think we have, a great thing at our disposal now. We have a great technological resource that enable us to kind of debate those ideas globally. Now, that on its own doesn't guarantee that we're going to be able to change the world, but I think it does offer us a big opportunity to create those connections, and I think we can build so much on it. And I'm definitely kind of immersing myself in it personally and hoping for the best.
Karl, it's been a pleasure having you on the show. I hope we cross paths in Lebanon sometime.
Yeah, fantastic. I look forward to it, and thanks so much, Bill.
That was Lebanese satirist Karl Sharro from KarlRemarks.com here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Real Clear Radio Hour is a partnership with Real Clear Politics, which the New York Times has called an invaluable tool for anyone interested in politics or public affairs. You can check out Real Clear Radio Hour on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at Real Clear Frezza. We'd like to thank our long-term sponsor, Old Boston Restorations, for their support. Old Boston is a boutique property management company in Boston's South End. Visit them online at oldbostonrestorations.net. Ahead, we'll speak with noted Iranian-American filmmaker Cyrus Nowrasteh about navigating the treacherous shoals of Hollywood political correctness. Stay tuned.